Hello and welcome to today's video. Many years ago, when I first got back into knitting, nearly 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, maybe just over 20 years ago now, I bought a skein of really beautiful lace mohair. Really pretty, beautiful colours, hand-dyed probably. I can't remember what make it was, but it was beautiful. And I wound it into a ball and I cast on for something. And I didn't get many rows into it before I was terrified and ripped it out and put it away. Then a few months later, I picked it up again, tried to cast on again, knitted a few rows, got terrified, ripped it out and put it away. And then eventually I destashed it at some point because I thought it's just too thin. I can't knit with this. I was too scared. So in today's video, I thought I would chat about getting used to knitting with thinner yarns. I've seen some comments on social media lately. One particular one was somebody saying, I'm trying to knit my first pair of socks, but the combination of the thin yarn and the thin needles is making it really difficult and I'm really struggling. How did you guys get used to knitting socks with such thin yarn and thin needles? And a lot of people have the same problem with lace knitting, especially very fine lace shawls. So today I thought I would give you my advice for getting used to knitting with thinner yarn, thinner needles, and more challenging patterns. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you're new here, my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns. I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website yarnaddict.co.uk. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Knitting with thin yarn, thin needles, and new techniques can be really challenging, regardless of your experience. I know people who've been knitting for decades, probably longer than me, but they always knit the same kind of thing in the same kind of yarn. So even though they would think of themselves as experienced because they'd knitted for 50 years, they're not actually that experienced because they don't knit a variety of things. It's mainly Aran weight baby cardigans, just as an example. Nothing wrong if you only ever knit Aran weight baby cardigans. Got no problem with that at all. Knit whatever you want as long as you enjoy it. But the number of years you've been knitting doesn't necessarily relate to your experience. I know knitters who've been knitting for a few months who are already tackling quite challenging things like socks. So your experience is really all about the techniques you know, the techniques you've tackled and are confident in, rather than the number of years you've been knitting. So when I say somebody with, so when I talk about regardless of experience, I mean if you haven't tried something new, if you've never tried brioche knitting and you've been knitting for 50 years, you're not experienced in brioche. You might be experienced in all the things you've been knitting for 50 years, but you're not experienced in brioche. So that, for example, I've been knitting since I was very young. I don't know when I learned to knit, but I'm 56 now, so I've probably been knitting for at least 45 years. I would say maybe between 45 and 50 years. I'm not sure. I can't remember learning to knit, so I don't know when I first learned to knit. My first kind of knitting memories are from when I was a teenager, but I knew that I knew how to knit at primary school, but I don't know when I learned to knit. So let's say 45 to 50 years. But I have never done, well, no, that's not true. I've had a go at double knitting. So double knitting is when you knit a double-sided fabric, so it's got the right side out on both sides of the fabric. And I've had a go at plain double knit, actually earlier this year, because I decided that this year is the year I'll teach myself how to do double knitting. And I was in Norway in February, and I just had to go with some very simple double knitting. But I would like to be able to do stranded colorwork double knitting because that looks really impressive, and I haven't tackled that yet. So I would say I'm a very experienced knitter in most techniques, but I'm not experienced in double knitting. If somebody asked me about double knitting, I would have to say, sorry, not done it, don't really know. Even if you're very experienced in one technique, doesn't make you experienced in everything or an expert on everything. And that comes for whatever the subject is. Getting back to the topic that we were talking about, what yarn thickness you're used to knitting with. If you're used to knitting with chunky and Aran weight yarn, even going down to DK might feel a bit scary. If you quite often knit chunky or Aran weight things and then you go right down to 4-ply or even lace weight, that's going to feel like you're knitting with like dental floss because it's so thin. And a lot of younger knitters and newer knitters, especially these days, do knit a lot of chunky. There's a lot of patterns easier patterns for newer knitters, especially aimed at younger knitters. I think there are knitted in chunky yarn, and there's nothing wrong with that. Personally, I don't like chunky yarn, so I can have a little bit of a kind of snobby attitude towards chunky yarn at times because I just don't like it. I haven't knitted with anything thicker than a DK for years. It's not quite true. I'm just looking at a swatch over in the corner of my room for a design that's coming out soon, and that is actually classed as an Aran weight yarn. And also my Small Delights scarf, which I knitted earlier this year, is also knitted in an Aran weight yarn. So not quite true. But I haven't knitted a garment in an Aran weight yarn for years. I haven't knitted a garment in a chunky yarn for even longer. I probably only designed one, maybe two garments in a chunky yarn in my whole nearly 20 years of designing, because I don't like thick yarns. I do like thin yarns. But when I first got back into knitting and started challenging myself to learn new things and knit with new techniques that I hadn't done before, I really struggled with thin yarn because I just wasn't used to it. So if you're used to knitting with DK yarn, going down to a 4-ply or fingering weight yarn may not be that much different. But if you're adding in new techniques and new needle sizes, thinner needle sizes, that might still be quite challenging. So in this video, I'm just going to go through some advice on what I recommend for how you can move down to thinner yarns and more challenging techniques. So first, I recommend that you get used to the new techniques using a yarn thickness that you're used to. So if your goal is to knit socks using 4-ply fingering weight sock weight yarn and sock needles, most socks are probably knitted on between 2.25mm to 2.75mm needles, and they can feel quite thin if you're used to knitting chunkier Aran weight or even DK weight yarn. If I've been knitting something on the DK for a few weeks and I pick up a pair of socks, the needles feel like toothpicks to me. Once I've knitted a few half an hour or so on a pair of socks, then going back to those thicker needles for an Aran weight garment or design feels like I'm knitting with tree trunks. So it's all about what you get used to. Getting used to new techniques using the thinner yarn doesn't mean you have to knit an actual project. For example, if you want to knit socks, if that's your goal, and you want to use either double pointed needles or magic loop, if you haven't used either of those before, maybe try both techniques and see which one you prefer. If you haven't got the needles for both of those, then I would recommend, if you're new to knitting socks, I would recommend magic loop. Magic loop is much more popular for socks these days than double pointed needles, and I would say easier. I have a tutorial on magic loop. If I remember, I will link it below, but it is in my circular knitting and needle review playlist, which is on my YouTube channel. But I think that getting used to knitting magic loop is easier than trying to knit socks for the first time on double pointed needles. You can also get the really small circular needles that are just long enough for the stitches you need for a sock. I personally don't use them because I find them too small. The needle tips are really short, and I don't find it very comfortable to knit with. I have quite big hands, and I like to hold the needle with my whole hand. So I like needle tips that are basically the width of my hand, so I can hold the whole needle tip. The tiny circular needles are just long enough for a sock, adult size sock. I have tried them. I've tried a couple of different brands. I don't like them. There's also some triangular ones. I can't remember what they're called now. I think they're from Addi. Other brands may do them. I've also tried those just briefly, and I wasn't that keen on them, so I haven't bothered buying those either, because again, the needle tips are too short. Going off topic slightly, but work out the right needle for you. So if the pattern says double pointed needles, can you do it on magic loop instead? It depends on how the pattern is written and how confident you are. So for example, socks written for double pointed needles, I can easily translate that to magic loop, but for somebody who's new to socks, it might not be that easy. So work out what needles you need to knit and what needle size. If you can get those needles in a bigger size, I appreciate you may not want to buy needles in the size you would normally use. Say, for example, if you want to knit socks, you may not want to buy double pointed needles in a thicker size. But maybe you've got a friend or somebody at your local knitting group, if you go to one, or something like that, that you can borrow from. So practice the techniques in a thicker yarn. Then do it again in a thinner yarn. So for example, if I want to knit socks and I'm used to knitting in chunky yarn, I would maybe go down to DK yarn. Knit, you don't have to knit a whole pair of socks or even a whole single sock, just knit a tube, knit a short tube, enough to get used to it. And then I might go back down to a 4-ply yarn and try it again and just knit a tube. So I get used to the yarn thickness and the needles before I start the actual project. And then you don't have that frustrating experience of starting something and having to rip it up multiple times because it looks awful because you're not used to that yarn and needle combination. So practice first. I know a lot of people view practice time as a waste of time. They'd rather be knitting on an actual project. And I appreciate that, especially if you don't have a lot of knitting time. That can feel frustrating. But if you are trying new techniques that are a bit more challenging, I do think practicing first saves you time in the long run and it saves you a lot of frustration. So I would recommend you to set aside a couple hours or an evening to do a bit of practicing. If your goal is to, for example, tackle a lace shawl, a more complicated lace shawl knitted in lace weight yarn, look to see what kind of shawl it is. Does it need, quite often it may recommend circular needles. Does it need to be knitted on circular needles? Most shawls that are shaped from the top down, so like a triangular shawl knitted top down with a center spine, half hexagon shawls, circular shawls knitted from the top, half circular shawls knitted from the top down. A lot of shawls start at the back of the neck with just a few stitches, and it gradually increases down and you end up with sometimes hundreds of stitches at the bottom. To comfortably do that, you really do need a circular needle because it can be difficult to fit that number of stitches on a straight needle. If it's a rectangular shawl or asymmetrical, some asymmetrical shawls, side-based knitted shawls, you may be able to comfortably do it on a straight needle. So just look at the shape, how many stitches you start out with, i.e. how many stitches you cast on and how many stitches you end up casting off. If you end up with a lot of stitches at the end, I would recommend you try circular needles because it will be more comfortable in the long run. But you can start on straight needles. You can practice on straight needles. So if I was going to start a lace shawl knitted from the top down, using techniques I'd never done before in a lace weight yarn, so something that has more than 800 meters per 100 grams, I would perhaps try and knit the beginning of the shawl in a thicker yarn first, just to get used to it, just to see if I actually know the technique and learn the technique. And especially if the shaping is a bit confusing and I can read the pattern and I can't quite visualize it, practicing knitting it in a thicker yarn first is a really good idea because it gives you a chance to try all the techniques. It's easier in a thicker yarn because you can see what you're doing properly and you can get used to the shaping, the stitches, all that kind of stuff before you tackle it in a thin yarn. Then maybe I will go down to a 4-ply yarn and try it again. Again, you don't have to knit very much. Practice swatch. Practicing new techniques on the swatch before going on to the real thing is always a good idea. Most designers will recommend that you swatch before starting a project anyway, but I appreciate, especially for accessories, a lot of people don't because size is not as important. For a garment, you should absolutely swatch first and check your tension. But knitting a little practice swatch just to practice new techniques is always a good idea. You can practice the techniques used in the pattern you want to knit. You can try the combination of the yarn and knitting needles to make sure they work. I remember years ago I tried this acrylic needles, I think they were. They were from Nipro. They were very colourful. All the sizes were different colours. I think it was some kind of acrylic material. I don't know. I bought them because they looked really, really nice and colourful, and they were awful to knit with. Depending on the yarn I used, with a lot of the yarns I used them with, it felt really squeaky, and I ended up getting rid of them eventually. So making sure that your needles and your yarn work together. Are your needles too slippery for the yarn you've chosen? For example, if you normally knit with metal needles and you're knitting with a silk yarn is very slippery, metal needles are very slippery, your stitches might just slide right off and you might need to think about wooden needles with a little bit more grip. So trying the needles and yarn combination is a good idea, and also making sure you like the yarn. If you have seen loads of mohair shawls that you really, really like and you fancy knitting one, but knitting with mohair drives you mad and makes you sneeze and you just get fluff on everything, maybe knitting an accessory in that yarn is not a good idea. Like, I think mohair looks beautiful and I see all these mohair sweaters, especially when I go to Norway. among Scandinavian knitters, mohair added to everything seems to still be a really big thing. I like the look of it. I don't like mohair because it ends up on everything. I've actually got in Norway, I've got this yarn. I've got enough either sweater holding one strand, or a vest holding two strands together, which is what I'm planning to do. So this is a swatch. The next time I go to Norway, I'm going to be casting on for that. I got in a sale when I was there in May, and I left it there thinking I'll work on that next time I go. Didn't work on it when I went in July because it was just too hot, but I'm going to knit that when I go in October. Thing is, I don't particularly like knitting with mohair because it ends up just on everything, and I wear a lot of black clothes. And I also don't know if I want to wear mohair because the fluff ends up on everything. But I really like the yarn, and it was really, really good price. So I'm going to knit a vest and see how we get on. I wouldn't have paid full price for that yarn because I would have been too worried about knitting it and not enjoying wearing it. So swatching, knitting a swatch, practicing, making sure you like the yarn, you like the needles, your yarn and needle combination work together. You can do all the stitches, all the techniques. It's always a good idea before you start the project. Once you're happy with the thinner yarn, thinner needles, the new techniques, all that kind of stuff, then you can put the yarn and the technique and the needles and everything together. And again, I would probably, depending on how confident you feel, it might be worth just knitting a small practice swatch before you start. So if your goal is to knit socks and you've got down to knitting with sock yarn, feeling comfortable, knitting with thin toothpick type needles feels comfortable, put it together and maybe knit part of the sock. So if you haven't done a heel turn before, maybe practice the heel turn. If it has a heel flap and heel turn, maybe just knit a few rounds and knit through the instructions for the heel turn and heel flap, just to make sure you're happy with it. Anything that will give you the confidence when you start an actual project, you can knit it without any problems and without having to rip back and getting frustrated and giving up. So just to sum up, my advice is if you want to try something more challenging with thinner yarn and thinner needles than what you're used to, practice first going to thinner and thinner yarn, and then thinner needles. Practice the techniques in a thicker yarn first, and then put it all together with the yarn weight and the needles and the techniques you want to use in your project. You're much more likely to be successful. You're much less likely to get frustrated and give up and end up throwing the project in the naughty corner. So let me know your experience on this. What kind of yarn do you normally knit with? Do you find it difficult knitting with thinner yarn and thinner needles? I think also age plays a difference here, and any problems with your hands. So if you have any hand pain, arthritis, knitting with thinner needles and thinner yarn can be challenging. Also, as I'm noticing, our eyesight does tend to get worse as we get older, and you may need better light, or you may need better reading glasses, or you may need to get your eyes checked and get proper or better prescription glasses. I have varifocals, and I have a bright light over my chair downstairs where I sit and knit. It comes right over my head. It's really bright, it's really ugly, but it does give me really good light for knitting. So whenever I sit there, even during the day when I'm knitting stuff that I don't really need that bright light for, I still put that bright light on. If that's not an option, or you knit out and about a lot, maybe consider something like a neck light. This is a brand called Glocusent, Glocusent. I got it on Amazon. I also got one for my mum for her birthday a few years ago. I find it quite comfortable. It's not too heavy. It has 3 light settings. A little bit bright, a bit brighter, and very bright. And you can angle it. So I can angle it up or down depending on what I'm knitting and what I need. I don't find it too heavy on my neck, and I do have neck problems, but I've worn it for quite a few hours and not found it a problem. I don't use it at home very often. I usually take it with me when I travel. So if I'm sitting in a hotel room or an Airbnb knitting, or like, for example, when I go to my parents in Norway, it wasn't a problem when I was there in July because it was lighter quite late. But when I go in September, the last 3 or 4 years I've gone in September, and I like to sit on their balcony because I find the chairs so more comfortable than the sofa. So quite often I'll sit there in the evening in September, because it's still warm enough to sit out there, but it gets darker earlier. So I end up using this just so I can see what I'm knitting. Or if I'm sitting at the airport knitting, for example, or on the plane, and especially if you're flying in the evening, when you're landing and takeoff, they have to dim the lights in the cabin. So if you're reading or knitting, then having these can be quite useful, so you can still see what you're doing. They are quite bright, so just be careful how you angle them so you don't annoy any of people sitting near you. I got these on Amazon. I will link them below. It is an associate link, I think. So if you buy something through that link, I will get a tiny percentage. So just so you're aware of that. But there's loads of varieties. This was one that was recommended to me by somebody who was in my workshop, so that's the one I decided buying. So if you've got any tips for getting used to knitting with thinner yarn, more challenging techniques, thinner needles, all the things we talked about today, please leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.